Hi everyone! Today I'm going to talk about common beginner gouache mistakes, and this video is actually inspired by my own mistakes that I made as a beginner when I was first learning how to use the medium. I remember when I first started I was really frustrated and confused about how to use gouache, and now when I look back at some of the first paintings that I attempted, I can recognize some of the mistakes that I was making and where I was going wrong. So this video is a reflection of the mistakes that I made, and I've narrowed it down to 5 mistakes, and I'm going to talk about them and how I overcame them. So the first mistake I made was not waiting for the layer underneath to dry completely before putting on the next layer. For example, if I wanted to paint some white stripes on top of this blue paint, if I try to go in with my white paint as soon as I've laid down the blue paint, so while it's still wet, then the 2 layers will just muddy together and there's no way I can get clean, crisp white lines, and that blue paint is just going to swallow the white paint. Even if I try to gently paint in a few dots without disturbing the layer underneath, it's still going to be nearly impossible to try and get that clean white on top of the blue. So instead what you should do is you have to wait for the paint to dry completely before you attempt to paint on another layer on top. So here I've sped up the drying process, and now when I paint in my white stripes you can see it doesn't muddy with the layer underneath because that layer is dry. Although it's actually not as simple as that, and I will come back to it in a little bit. So here you can see I'm just quickly and confidently painting on these clean, crisp white lines. I can also paint on some white dots and they also won't disturb the layer underneath. You can also paint in some thicker lines as well, as long as you're being quite gentle with the way you're layering on the next layer. One thing to be careful of is you want to just lay down one single clean stroke. If you weren't happy with the first one and you try to go in with a second or third stroke to fix it, you'll actually make the situation worse because you'll just be disturbing the layer underneath even more. You'll also need to make sure that the white paint is a thicker consistency than the blue. If you use really thin down watery paint, then again it's going to disturb the blue underneath because it's as if you're layering water on top of the blue, which will reactivate it, since traditional gouache can be reactivated with water. It's not so bad if you're just trying to paint in little dots because there's minimum disturbance to the layer underneath, but if you're trying to paint in a stripe or something, then you will end up disturbing the paint underneath. So instead you want to use paint that's quite a thick consistency, or at least thicker than the layer underneath. So if you have made these mistakes, you can actually fix them quite easily. All you have to do is just wait for that layer to dry completely and then come back and just go over what you did and just do it once and do it confidently and do it cleanly. You might also be layering paint not on top of each other but next to each other, and in this case, if you don't want them to muddy together, you'll also need to wait for the first part to dry completely before you try to paint next to it. For example, here if I lay down some black paint and I need to paint some yellow stripes next to it, if I don't wait for the black to dry and I try to paint in the yellow right next to it, that edge is going to muddy and it's going to cause the black paint to bleed over into the yellow. This used to happen to me a lot, and the more I try to fix it, the more it would just bleed and get muddy, and I realized in the end that I had to just be a bit more patient and just wait for the paint to dry completely, because once it's dry and you go and try and paint that clean yellow line next to it, even if you cross over the edge a little bit, it's not going to bleed like it was if it was wet. As long as you're still being fairly careful, you should get a nice clean line. So again, if you made this mistake, you can just let it dry and then go over it once. If you feel like that's not enough, you can let it dry again and go over it a second time. So it's just a matter of knowing how long to wait before you can start painting on top of it or next to it. I also started experimenting with this, and I realized you could get some pretty cool effects if you purposely tried to get the paint to bleed. So in one of my previous painting tutorials, I laid down some really wet paint and then I quickly went in with some more paint underneath, and this caused the paint above it to bleed into it, which created the perfect misty effect that I was going for. So before I move on, I just want to point out here that the mistakes that I've labeled in this video aren't necessarily mistakes if you intend to use the gouache in this way. These are just some struggles that I had when I didn't understand how to use the medium the way that I wanted. But if you have this knowledge and you use it to your advantage, then it's not a mistake, it's just a way of using gouache. Alright, so the next mistake that I made was not being aware that lighter colors or lighter values dry darker and darker colors dry lighter. So an easy way to demonstrate this or to test this for yourself is just to use some black paint fresh out of the tube and just paint it on the paper, and then if I move my camera around, you can already see how the areas that are drying lighter than the areas of paint which are still wet. Now the paint has dried completely, and if I lay in some black paint next to it, so remember this is the same black paint, it's just fresh out of the tube, I haven't done anything to it. If I lay that next to the dry paint, you can visibly see how much darker it is when it's wet. And another way you can also test this is to just put some water on the paint. So here I'm just using clean water and I'm just putting some on the paint, and you can see as soon as that water touches the black paint that's dried, the part that had the water in it becomes visibly darker. Now if we let it dry again, you'll see that it dries to the same value as the other dried paint. So this just demonstrates how darker values will dry lighter in gouache. Now let's look at how lighter values will dry darker. So this one was a little bit trickier to show on camera. I felt like it wasn't showing up as obviously as it was in person, and I tried a few times to try and get this part to be more obvious. In the end, I ended up looking over at the puddle of paint that I was working with, and I realized that that was actually the perfect example to show how lighter colors will dry darker. So when I had a look at the paint, you can see on the outer edges where the paint has already started to dry, it has dried a darker shade of pink than the original pink that I was working with. So you can see the outer edge has already dried, and you can see the inside of the pool is still completely wet. So what I did was I just got a hairdryer and I just sped up the drying process, and now you can visibly see how this light pink has dried a darker shade. So when I was starting out with gouache, I was really intimidated by how much the values changed when the paint dried, and I would start panicking when I saw the paint doing things that I didn't expect it to do. So my advice here is firstly to mix more paint if you know you need to just block in a flat color, so that way you're not going to run out of that color and then have to go through the struggle of trying to match the exact same shade. Second piece of advice is it's just handy to always keep this in mind whenever you're trying to mix colors. Just keep in mind that if you're trying to get a light color, it's going to dry a little bit darker, so just aim for an even lighter value, and if you're trying to get a dark value, just remember it's going to dry slightly lighter, so aim for an even darker value. The third mistake is using water to lighten the color of a paint. So this could potentially be a habit that comes from watercolor, because in watercolor you don't really use white paint, you just use water if you want to lighten the color of a paint. But with gouache, because it can be used as an opaque medium, if you're constantly using water to dilute out the paints to get it to be lighter, then you're going to end up with an inconsistent consistency of paint across one layer. So for example, here you have a more opaque consistency at the top, and then as it moves down, the paint becomes more and more transparent. So instead what you should do is you should just add white in order to lighten the color. So at the top I'm starting off with more of an opaque consistency, and as I move down I am maintaining that consistency of paint, and I'm just adding in more white to lighten the color. So you can expect to use a lot of white gouache in your paintings, and it's most likely going to be the first tube of paint that you run out of. I've gone through my fair share of white gouache, and now I've bought a really big tube because I know that I'm going to use it up really quickly. So don't feel bad if you feel like you're using a lot of white gouache, because that's totally normal and that's what you should be doing. Here's another example of a recent painting I did where I just needed to block in a blue sky, and I simply just transitioned it from blue to an even lighter blue by just adding in more white paint. I didn't dilute out the paints to lighten it. That would result in the bottom part being a lot more transparent, which isn't what I want. I want the consistency to be much more opaque. So I make sure that I'm using white paint and not water to lighten the paint. The fourth mistake is diluting your paints with too much water in order to try and get your paints to spread further. So I guess it's the same as the last mistake. It's about controlling your water to gouache ratio. So I definitely did this a lot when I first started. I would just keep diluting my paints to try and get it to cover the page. But instead, what I should have been doing is I should be adding more paint in each time I add more water, so that way I'm maintaining the ratio of gouache to water so I don't end up with a very transparent consistency. So here you can see I started off with a much too transparent consistency, then all I'm doing is just adding in more paint so it becomes a bit more opaque, and to get it even more opaque you can add in another layer of paint. Once you build up the opacity of the paint, then it's going to be a lot easier for you to mix colors on the paper because there's just a lot more pigment for you to work with. Whereas if you have it in a really watered down texture, it's not going to be as easy to blend the paints on the paper, or the result won't look as nice because it's going to look kind of streaky. But thinning down your paints isn't necessarily a mistake because you can work with gouache in different opacities. You can work with it in a very transparent nature so it looks more like watercolor. I do use it like this when I'm painting in an underpainting or a base layer, but I also continue to build up my layers until I get a much more opaque consistency. So the mistake for me came from not understanding that I needed to add in more paint every time I added in more water if I wanted to achieve that thicker consistency, which is what I was going for, because I wasn't aware that I wasn't adding enough paint. Getting the right consistency with gouache is definitely one of the trickiest things, but it just comes with practice, so you just have to keep practicing it and eventually you'll get a feel for it. The fifth and last mistake is letting your paints dry out on the palette. The problem with this is once the paint dries, you can never quite get it back to the same consistency as it was fresh out of the tube. So while you can still reactivate the paint and continue to use it, it's just a bit harder. You have to put in a bit more effort and you have to use more water. So usually the texture of the paint is a bit more watery because you're using more water to try and reactivate it, and you can't get that same smooth buttery texture. I also feel like it slows down the painting process because I'm spending quite a bit of time just kind of working out that dried out piece of paint. Although I do try and save on paint, so if I do finish a session and I don't use up all the paint on the palette, I'll just leave it there and continue using it the next day. So this is an example of one that's been left on my palette for over a day, and while I do use it again, it's not ideal during a painting session to let it dry out like this. You can see here that it becomes quite watery. There are also some paints where once it's dried, you really can't rework it anymore because it becomes all cracked, and when you try and reactivate it, it just crumbles into tiny little bits, which just isn't pleasant to use. My solution to this problem is just to prevent the paints from drying in the first place by using a spray bottle to mist them every few minutes or whenever I start to notice that they might be drying out a little bit, because you really do want to use the gouache in its freshest consistency, fresh out of the tube. I've also seen some people using the Stay Wet palette. This isn't something that I've tried yet, but it does seem like a good solution to the problem as well. If you use tube paints but you prefer to squeeze them out into a palette and close it with a lid, or you prefer to use gouache like the Himi gouache, then it's also important to remember to keep them really fresh. So I just mist my Himi gouache paints once or twice a week, or just whenever I remember to check in on them, and when I'm using them during a painting session, I'm spraying them lots to make sure that they're still staying wet because they're open and exposed to the air while I'm painting. So these are the 5 mistakes that I wanted to talk about in this video. I hope you guys found it helpful and that you were able to learn something from the mistakes that I was making as a beginner, and maybe you relate to some of it as well. Gouache is a really fun medium, so don't give up on it. Keep trying and experimenting. Let me know in the comments what else you might be struggling with as a beginner, and maybe I can try address some of these in my next video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye bye!